Hey everyone, and welcome back to Build UX. In this episode of the CRM Inbox series, we're going to finish designing our inbox component. Where we left off last time was we designed the message component as part of our molecules in our design files. Now it's time to take these individual messages and combine them into a message list. If we check our reference design, you'll see that the message list can have a flexible number of messages, and these could either be the active state or the default state. After tackling the message list, we'll move on to the inbox header and take care of the title, this counter element, the add new message button, and this filter dropdown. So the first step is if we jump into our molecules page, we can create a new frame, and let's drag one out of a pretty decent size here. We'll rename this to be message list dark. Drag this to the bottom of our layers. And let's give it a background of main background dark. Next up, using our assets panel, which we can access using Alt or Option 2, let's grab one of our message components found underneath the molecules heading. So we'll drag in a default instance here. And we know we also have an active instance in our reference design. Going back to our layers panel, using Alt or Option and 1, we can now start arranging the actual list of messages in our inbox feed. So we'll drag the default state to come first. Selecting both message components, let's distribute the vertical spacing and make sure that's 0. And we'll also make sure that these are aligned horizontally to the center. Next up, let's duplicate the default message and drag it down so it follows the active one. And we'll keep duplicating these to get a couple going. We can actually select all of these layers and repeat those same steps for distributing vertical space, bringing that down to 0. Now's a good time to think through the dimensions of the message list itself. So if we look at a reference design, we know that this is going to be around 522 in terms of the original reference. To keep it in line with our 8-pixel grid, I think I want this dimension to be 512. So we can quickly adjust the dimensions of our frame here to be 512. And let's grab all of these message components and get them to be equally spaced around this frame. So we have 32 pixels on the top, left, and right. And let's make sure that the bottom of this frame also has 32 pixels spacing. So holding Control or Command plus Shift and the down arrow, let's space it down 4 times. And keep in mind my nudge amount under Preferences is set to 8 pixels for the big nudge size. Now at this point, it's as simple as componentizing this group of messages together. So holding Control or Command plus Alt or Option and K, we can turn this into a component. Hitting Control or Command R, let's rename this to be message list dark. And the last thing we want to do here is enable clip content on the parent component. Now opening this up, let's go into each of these nested components and let's make sure that they're set to scale with the left and right and pinned to the top. Now, if we select the parent message list component, we can actually grab the frame and adjust it to whatever height we want. And this will simulate a scrolling container that keeps some of the messages out of view if the viewport height doesn't allow for the full extent. Now, we enabled some pretty robust layout grids in the previous episode. So if we use Control-G on Mac or Control-Shift-4 on Windows, we can enable these and help us snap the frame into any number of messages that we see. One last thing to check here is make sure our layer sequence matches the visual sequence, just to keep things nice and organized. And as a demonstration of this overflow behavior, let's duplicate this last message and drag it so it's completely outside of our frame. And you'll see that it wants to go outside of our component, so we'll want to make sure that it's still part of the actual component and that the spacing between all of these subcomponents is still 0. So that clip content is now being used, and if we ever end up with a taller viewport, we can simulate that behavior by reviewing another message below. And that's it for our message list component. So let's make sure this frame is spaced evenly with the rest of our documentation. And holding Alt or Option, let's drag out a copy of this entire frame. Moving this to the bottom of our layer list, we can rename this to be message list light. And then we'll go in and override the colors and the instances inside as needed. So on the frame that we just created, we can swap this over to being main background light. And if we go into our nested components, what we can do is actually select all of the default options. And using the instance panel, we'll want to go to our molecules dropdown, messages light, and go for the default variation there. We can follow the same process for our active variation to get that traded over. So messages light and the active. Now the last step here is if we were to componentize this directly, we would have too many layers of nested components, and that would restrict the ability to have these message components scale with the left and right variation of the parent list itself. So instead of that, we're going to detach this instance and then componentize it once more. And from here, we can rename this to be message list light. And that way, if we make any layout changes to the parent, all of the nested message components will update accordingly. With that taken care of, let's turn our attention to finalizing the rest of the inbox area. So looking at our reference design, the message list is complete. And now we can turn our attention to the inbox title, this counter component, the add button, and the filter dropdown. So what might be good at this stage is to make a copy of our reference design and drag it right into our organisms page. We can use this as a reference to iteratively replace all the components that we need. Now holding Control or Command plus Alt or Option and G, we want to convert this into a frame. And let's rename this Inboxes. This will come last in our Layers panel, and make sure as always that we have consistent spacing in our design documentation. Now we have this inbox group as kind of a mock-up, and what we can do is basically remove all of the temporary message components that we built out as our reference. With those gone, we can go into our Assets panel and grab the newly created message lists. So we have the dark that we can drag into place, and that'll help us get everything established. And if we go back to the inbox that we're starting to mock up, we'll remember that we wanted to update these dimensions to be 512 in their width. Now the height, let's double check real quick to see how much is needed. We can think through what a 4 pixel gap between the header and the inbox would leave us in terms of the remaining viewport. So I'm going to temporarily drag out a rectangle here, and let's take a quick measurement. So we have 1194, and if we take off 4 pixels, that'll leave us with a height of 1190. So back to our inbox draft here, I'm going to change the plate to be 1190 in height. One last thing is I'm actually going to ungroup the original inbox and start getting our components arranged here. And so with this process, it's really nice because we can keep replacing individual items of our inbox one by one with components until we're ready to componentize the whole set. So while we're here, we want to get this message list centered neatly inside of this design. So there's 32 pixels left and right padding, and this will actually be aligned to the very bottom of our inbox. Next up, let's address this typography. So let's select this title, maybe renaming it to inbox title. And since there's no text style applied, let's instead apply title 1 and make sure that the fill is set to high contrast for the dark variation. With that taken care of, let's look at the spacing here. So I think we want this to be 64 pixels off the left, and the vertical spacing, I'd like it to be 32 pixels, but that might be for the full header. So let's wait to get our button in place, and then we can vertically center all of these header elements together. Next up, what we can do is take this unread counter and copy it out, and we'll use this to build out a new component with it. So we can go into our atoms page, and let's scroll over here and paste it in. and we can draw a new frame around it and call it counters. I think because of the color theming here, we actually only need one style for both themes, so we can just use this singular component. Let's set the background to main background dark and dig into our existing layers here. So the first thing is to address the typography. It looks like this is pretty close to our body type spec, the body small type spec actually. So let's go find that text style. So body small, that looks good. We want it vertically centered. So align middle as well as text align center. And the fill should be set to high contrast for the dark theme. Next up, let's take this plate background, and it looks like we'll need to establish the gradient for the accent colors. So looking at our color swatches here, we define our accent default. We also have the start and end points of the gradient defined. So we can quickly create a couple rectangles to use as temporary swatches. And let's set the accent background start and endpoints to each of these swatches. Next up, let's grab our plate here. And with the linear gradient, we can sample these colors directly for the start and endpoints. And lastly, let's add this as a new fill style called accent gradient. So that way we can reuse it throughout our design. So with that gradient taken care of, let's turn our attention now to the overall layout of this component. So if we use Alt or Option and inspect the spacing, we can see our recreation has a slight variation on the right side padding. So let's actually take this plate and using Control or Command and the left arrow, let's reduce its width by 1 pixel. Now if we check the spacing, we'll see that's even all the way around here. Now typically on our 8 pixel grid, I'd like the spacing to be either 8 or 16 pixels. I might sometimes consider 12 or 14. Here we have 10, which isn't ideal, but we can evaluate if we're comfortable with this slight deviation. One thing I'd like to address is the border radius. I think we can reduce this down to 10 to give it a little bit more of that rounded square look that's consistent throughout the rest of our UI. We're also done with these temporary swatches, so we can delete those. And instead of unread, let's maybe rename this group to be counter and rename each of the layers to correspond there. Instead of counter number, I think this will actually be the count. And then we have the counter plate. And with that, I think we're ready to componentize. So Control or Command plus Alt or Option and K. And this counter component should be ready to go. One last detail is to probably add a layout grid. So let's add that. Click into our options here. Let's change this from grids to columns. 1 count. We'll use that same light green swatch we've been using throughout our designs. It'll be a stretch type. Margin's going to be 10, and the gutter will be 0. And that just gives us these nice lines for reference. With that, let's check our layout constraints. So the actual count itself, we want to be centered in both directions. And then our plate should scale left and right, but otherwise be vertically centered. And I think that takes care of things. So let's get our documentation spacing established. 32 pixels all around. I'm going to drag the corner of this frame. And then using Control or Command plus Shift, I'm going to hit down 4 times and right 4 times. And that'll give it 32 pixels spacing all around. Next up, let's space it away from our other frames on the page, and I believe that'll take care of things. Let's drag the counters to the bottom of these layers, and now we have that component to use in our new organism for the inbox. So in our Assets panel, under Atoms, we should see the counters appear. Let's drag that in to our new component and get it positioned where we want it. So I think we could do 16 pixels spacing and have it vertically centered with our existing inbox title. Let's drag it to follow the inbox title and delete the unread component there. And one thing I'm noticing is it looks like our layout grid doesn't match the other one. So let's see what's going on there real quick, just in terms of the styling. So if we pop this open, find our local colors. Yeah, it looks like it's this other green at 50% opacity. So my mistake on that. But now that our layout grid matches, let's turn our attention to this primary icon button. So again, we can copy this out and we'll create a new frame on our atoms page for this. Paste it in place. Let's rename this to primary icon buttons. And this will be for the dark variation. We'll drag this frame to the bottom of our layers, get it aligned as always, and set the main background to the dark theme. So this button already has the linear gradient. Let's make sure it's using that new swatch we created. So we'll go down to accent. And there's the accent gradient. We can get that applied. Icon plus is currently not referencing our actual icons. So under assets, let's go under icons dark and find the plus variation that we need. Drag that into place. Make sure this is part of our layers here. And get that centered up within our plate. So we'll use the alignment tools there. We can delete this draft of the icon. And I think the last thing to really think through on this default state is what the focus ring or focus indicator will look like. I like to include this in the first or default instance of every component. That way it's easy to toggle on when you need it. So what I'll do is I'll actually copy this plate and let's rename this to be the focus indicator. We also want to make sure that any of these custom elements follow our naming convention. So we have primary icon button for both of these layers. Now, since we copied this plate, we know that's 36 by 36. I think what I'd like is a 2 pixel thick border around this button with a 1 or 2 pixel gap. So instead of a fill, let's add a stroke. And again, it'll be 2 pixels. I think we can pick the start color of our accent gradient. And let's increase the width and height, constraining the proportions to achieve the gap that we're looking for. I think we need 42 pixels because if we center this vertically and horizontally with our existing plate, we should end up with a 1 pixel gap around the perimeter. Now we're also going to need to adjust the corner radius of our focus ring so it better matches the visual styling that we see here. So we'll increase that. It looks like to 16 pixels, follows that edge nicely. And let's make sure all of these elements are centered up as needed. Now with this, the focus ring will be off by default. And so we can simply componentize this and rename it to primary icon button dark. And this is the default state. Let's address our layout constraints now. So all of these should actually be set to be center. And the last thing I'd like to do is actually reduce the frame of the primary icon button component to be that 36 by 36 dimension that we have. So just checking that all of our layout appears as expected. But now the actual layout frame is unaffected by the focus indicator, which mimics the behavior when it comes to develop this. So let's get this spaced out appropriately. And now we can actually drag out different variations of this icon component. So first up, let's design a hover state. So we're going to modify the fill gradient of the plate itself. So we're going to detach the fill style here, and going into our linear gradient settings, let's decrease the lightness value by 10 points for both the start and end points. That way we have a drastic change in the fill color. Now, since we created this new gradient, we can actually call this accent gradient, and this will be the hover state. It reminds me that we probably want to address the naming convention for the other gradient. So instead of accent slash gradient, let's rename this to be accent gradient slash default. That feels a little better. We can actually rearrange these to come right after the start and end points that we've defined here in our palette. Now with these color changes, we can recomponentize this second variation and call it hover. And then selecting our default instance once more, let's duplicate it, drag it to the bottom of our layers, arrange it on the right side of our frame here, turn on this focus indicator. We'll want to match the hover style over actually. So we'll apply that new gradient. And this will act as our focus variation. So we can componentize this and we can update the naming. Now this takes care of the buttons for our inbox that we see here. But if we take a quick inventory of our design, we'll notice that there's also this send button in the bottom right corner. And if we look at this, it has a larger size of 50 by 50. So I'm going to copy this out, making sure that the full button is selected. And we'll paste this into our atoms as a reference. Now, since we have two sizes, I might actually go ahead and rename these existing components to reflect the sizing in the name. So with these three layers selected, I'm going to hit Control, Command, and R. Let's actually match the word dark with the slashes before and after. And we'll want the theme to still precede the sizing. So we'll replace that with dark and let's say medium with a slash to follow. So that way it's inserted into the naming. Now this will allow us to create a large variation that fits in with our naming convention. So let's grab this plate as a reference. And instead of 50 by 50, let's bring this down to be 48 by 48. And the 20 pixel corner radius looks good for our use case here. We'll change the constraints to be center while we're at it and apply that default accent gradient that we created earlier. Now we'll replace the send icon with our own that we redesigned. So we'll grab that from our atoms in our assets pane, get it centered up within the plate and delete the original reference. Only thing left to do here is address this drop shadow that we're seeing. And this is something we just matched manually in our designs, but it's time to actually add this as an effect style. And while we're at it, I think I'd like to introduce a little more nuance with our drop shadows so they have two distinct layers to them to give it a little bit more realistic depth. So zooming in here so we can evaluate what we're looking at. I think right now this primary drop shadow is too strong. So I'd like to reduce this down a bit. And it looks like somewhere between 20 and 30% looks good. I think I'll like it around 28% here. So we'll keep that one. What I'd like to do is introduce a secondary drop shadow that's much tighter to give it a little bit more of a realistic depth to it. So let's go ahead and add another effect. And this drop shadow, we'll want to use that same color so we can copy that from our first drop shadow and paste it in place. Obviously the opacity looks pretty strong, but let's actually play around with the blur and the Y displacement. And I think I actually like that. It has a nice strong edge to it and then quickly falls off with that softer drop shadow as well. It gives it some nice depth for this dark background. Last thing here, let's rename this plate to be primary icon button. And this is the large plate. That reminds me that we'll probably want to update the naming for both of the medium-sized ones. So we'll find the slash and replace it with slash medium to insert it in there. And the last thing we need to do is design that focus indicator like we did before. So we'll duplicate this plate. Instead of plate in the naming, we'll call this the focus indicator. For when this interactive element receives keyboard focus, let's take away the gradient fill. We'll add a stroke, remove the drop shadow, and the stroke color will be the accent gradient start. Now, same as before, we want to do some quick calculation to think through what size this needs to be. So we have 2 pixels, a 1 pixel gap, and then the same thing on the right. So we need 6 pixels overall to be added to the focus ring. So let's say bump this up to 54. That's looking good. Make sure all of our elements here are centered. And let's address the border radius here. So we'll need to increase it until it matches the curve of what we have going on here. So it looks like 23 pixel quarter radius just to match the edges of the actual plate. With that, we can componentize this to be primary icon button. This is the dark theme, large size, and default state. So I know the naming convention looks a little bit burdensome here, but it encapsulates all of the variations that we need. Same as before, let's make sure all the constraints of the sub elements are set to center. And we can reduce the actual frame of this component down to 48 by 48. So only the actual plate of the element affects the layout. Get our layers arranged here real quick. And this focus indicator is turned off by default. Same as before, let's drag out a new copy. Make sure our spacing looks correct. This new copy, all we need to change is the accent gradient to the hover state and recomponentize for hover. Lastly, one more copy of our default instance. Drag this out to the right, equal spacing. Let's extend our frame while we're at it. Make sure this is at the bottom of our layers. Turn on the focus ring, swap out the gradient for the hover style, and we can componentize this last variation. Now with all of these, we have the top and left spacing looking correct. Let's adjust our frame to be spaced as needed. And that looks good for all of our primary icon buttons. Now with those taken care of, I just realized we didn't apply any sort of drop shadow to the medium size. So let's go ahead and get that taken care of. If we look at our effect styles, we have elevation 1 and some drop shadows for a notification dot. I think we need to add a second elevation for this primary icon button. So we can target the plate of that icon button directly. Let's add an effect for a drop shadow. And I think we want maybe 16 pixels of blur, 4 pixels on the Y, and then we'll use that same color we used earlier, which is 121217. Let's take a look and see how this feels. So I think we need a more dramatic blur. I'm going to bump that up to be 32 pixels, but maybe bring the opacity down just a little bit here. So we have a nice, soft, subtle drop shadow there. Now I'm going to repeat that same trick of having a secondary, more crisp drop shadow on here. So I'm going to add a second drop shadow. We want to use that same color swatch as before. I think the 4 pixel blur is looking good. The Y displacement is a little too much here. And I think the opacity be nudged down a little bit as well. Now if we zoom out, let's give this a good look. That gives it some nice depth without being overpowering. So that's looking good. We can add this effect style now. Let's call this elevation 2 dark. And I like how that looks. This sets us up well to handle the light variations for these icon buttons. So if we drag out a new instance, we can swap over the background color to light, rename the frame for the theme name. And I think the only change we really want to make here is adjusting the drop shadows for the white theme. I think all the color variations, we know the color has enough contrast on a white background as well. So I think we're good to simply change it up for the drop shadow effect. Now I'm going to remove the hover and focus styles for each of these because we'll work off the default instance and then copy them out from there. So we have a good starting place with this elevation 2 dark. Let's detach this style and adjust it to be a little more subtle for our light background. I think I'm going to take the blur down a little bit here. It looks a little too strong, maybe 16 pixels. And I like that spread, but let's reduce the opacity as well. I think around 14% is looking good. Let's also address the sharper version of our box shadow here. Blur and spread, I think we'll want to keep. Let's maybe reduce the opacity here as well. So with that layer selected, let's add this as the elevation 2 for the light theme. And while we're at it, let's adjust the accent drop shadow that we have down below. So one thing I'm seeing is we never added an effect style for this drop shadow. So let's go to our dark variation real quick. Pop open the default for our large button. And let's get this added as elevation accent for the dark theme. Now if we turn our attention back to this large button for the white theme, let's detach the style so we have a good starting point. And I like the blur and the Y distance here. I think we need to reduce this opacity down though. 15% looks good for me. So now let's look at this smaller drop shadow. And I think the same thing here, we probably just need to adjust the opacity. I think 20% should be good. Just gives us a nice subtle lift off the page there. So with that, we can recomponentize each of these. This will be for the light theme. And then we can go through the same steps of duplicating out each state and making the variations as needed. All right, and with those taken care of, let's drag one into our inbox organism here. So we can go into our assets panel. These are found in the atoms heading. We want to use the default state of our add button and get that roughly into position here. We can delete our reference, and now we can get all three elements of this header centered up vertically. And with that, we can check the vertical spacing off the top of the inbox. Let's reduce that down to 32 pixels. And let's get our icon button to be inset from the right, 64 pixels, to match the left alignment there. Now the last thing to address here is this drop-down trigger for our filter. So let's copy that out and create a couple more frames in our atoms page here. So we have drop-down trigger for the dark theme. This is plural. Drag that down, set the background color to main background dark, and let's paste in our reference to work off of. So first off, this label, let's apply a text style. It looks like this is probably closest to our micro sizing for the body type spec. And the icon caret, we can grab that from our design atoms here. So we have this small caret icon there. That's 16 by 16. And we can get these centered up vertically, deleting the reference. And let's also rename the typography here to drop-down trigger. And this will be the label. Spacing between these elements, let's say 16 pixels. It looks a little big, maybe 8. And that's looking a little better to my eye. Last thing we need to think through is some sort of background plate for this element. So temporarily, I'm just going to give it a background color so we can see what we're doing here. Let me pick something a little easier to spot our dimensions with. I think we want probably 16 pixels padding left and right. And then I'd like to end up with an overall component size of 40 pixels tall. So we can select all three of these elements, get them vertically centered. Let's go ahead and rename this plate layer as well. And we can think through the internal padding of this button that we're building. So I might drag the edges in to meet the edges of our internal elements here. One thing to note is that we have this larger view box on the icon caret, but visually it comes inset quite a bit here. So what I might do is actually bring this in 4 pixels so it's a little bit more balanced on the left and right. And again, this is just a reference of how the internal layout of this component should work. So this would represent the edges, so we need to add our padding back in. I think I want 16 pixels spacing on left and right sides. So holding Control or Command plus Shift, I'm going to use the right arrow a total of 4 times. So we add 16 pixels on the left and right. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And now if we move this plate left 16 pixels, we've visually centered up the elements inside. Now, the actual plate of this by default won't have any fill state, so we'll just leave that completely unfilled. This just helps define the boundaries of the component. What I'd like to do from here is think through the hover and focus styles. So let's duplicate this plate, and let's actually give it a fill color. So we can open up a fill, and looking through our color swatches, I think something just to offset it from the background will be great for a hover state. So we can give it elevation background 1 start. Now to match some of the visual aesthetic throughout the rest of the app, I think we want to add some border radius here. So 4 pixels, let's see how 8 pixels feels. Yeah, I think 8 pixels gives it a nice rounded look that matches the rest of our UI. So we can rename this layer, and this will be the hover plate, which will be turned off by default. While we're here, we can duplicate this once more and create our focus indicator. So this focus indicator, it won't have a fill, but it will have a stroke. So let's give it maybe a 2 pixel stroke and think through the styling of this. I think I want it to be high contrast for the dark theme. And so if we turn both these layers off, this will represent our default state. So we're ready to componentize this. Let's call it dropdown trigger dark. And now think through the layout constraints of each of these elements. So the text, I want to scale left and right, but be centered vertically. The icon will be pinned to the right at all times and also centered vertically. And then the 3 various plates or focus indicators here, left and right scaling and centered vertically. And so now I believe if we adjust the dimensions of this, the text will take up as much space as it can, but break to a new line if none is available. To help document this component, let's add a layout grid. And this will be columns, single count. The color, we can use our local color we've been using throughout. The margin is 16 and the gutter is 0. This just helps us visualize the layout intent of this component. So with that taken care of, let's get it positioned here. And we'll probably have to give ourselves some more space to work with. Next up, we can drag out a copy of this default state. And we'll turn on the hover plate, componentize this, and rename it for the hover state. That reminds me that we need to add /default to our original naming. So that way the state is always indicated as part of the component name. Last up, one more instance. We're going to turn on both the focus indicator and the hover plate, and this will be our focus variation. All right, with these taken care of for the dark theme, let's position our frame as needed. We can drag out a copy of this. Bottom of the layers, rename for the light theme, and quickly move through reskinning these as needed. So we'll delete our hover and focus variations, set the background to main background light, open up our drop-down trigger, and we're going to swap all the colors as needed. It looks like we never applied the high contrast color for the fill on our default state, so let's make sure that's in place. So that's looking good. Our icon already has that provided by default as a component. And so now we can swap this over to high contrast dark. For the icon, let's swap out the instance. So we'll go down to atoms, icons light. This will be a small and the caret. Just double checking the fill is high contrast for the light theme. That looks good. Next up, our focus indicator is high contrast light. Hover plate will be elevation 1. I think we'll need, if we turn this on, probably background end, it looks like, to actually provide enough differentiation. And the main plate of the component will remain unfilled. Let's make sure that hover plate is turned off by default and recomponentize this for the light theme. drag out a couple copies here, turn on the hover plate, recomponentize and rename, and turn on the hover and focus indicators, recomponentizing and renaming as needed. All right, now with all those taken care of, I think we're ready to finish out our inbox. So let's go into our assets panel. We have our new dropdown trigger as a component. We can drag that right into place here. Delete our original filter and start establishing some of the spacing between these components. Now I'm going to treat the header visually as one component or layout boundary. So let's make sure that's 32 pixels of spacing from the top there. The left side, I want this to visually align with the left edge of the text and the following message components as well. So let's make sure that these visually align across the board. It looks like we need 48 pixels left padding to get that left alignment that we're looking for. So with that left alignment taken care of, let's think through the spacing we want between the filter and our message list. I know we have 41 pixels. I think we can actually bring up the message list probably pretty close to the filter itself. So let's try 8 pixels here. And just to check, we'll swap this from the default state to the active state and make sure it doesn't look too claustrophobic. I think that'll work well for us and give a little more association between the filter and the list itself. Now, the only thing with the message list here is to adjust it so it reveals more of the following components beneath and matches up with the bottom edge of our inbox. Obviously, it doesn't have quite enough room for the next message to show, but it mimics the actual behavior of the scrolling container. And with that, I think we're ready to componentize this whole component now. So Control Command plus Alt or Option and K. Let's componentize this as inbox for the dark theme. And now start thinking through our different layout constraints that we need. So I might actually group these top items as the inbox header. And the header should scale with the left and right, but be pinned to the top. Within this, I want the inbox title and the counter to be pinned to the left, and the primary icon button to be pinned to the right side. Next up, this drop-down filter would also be pinned to the left, as well as the top. And the message list component, we can have this pinned to scale to the left and right, and scale with the top and bottom of our inbox itself. And so we'll add main background light, similar to our other organisms here. Get this component spaced, and then we can test it out to make sure our layout constraints work as expected. So now with this, if we were to adjust the width of our inbox, you see that all of our components adapt dynamically, which is great. Similarly, if we were to reduce the height of it, we see that clipping action come into play with our message list. Last step here, drag out a copy of the inbox we just created. And let's retheme this for the light variation. So first thing, let's swap out our plate color to be component background light. And it looks like we need to assign that swatch to our dark variation as well. With that taken care of, high contrast light. The counter stays the same. The primary icon button, we want to swap this over for the white variation. This is our medium default style. Moving on, drop-down trigger, atoms, drop-down triggers light, default. And message list, we have our light variation there. And that's it. We rethemed the entire inbox. We can rename this inbox light, and let's drag it into the refinement of our designs. So we can delete this entire inbox section here and go over to our assets panel, find our organism section, grab an inbox and drag it right into place. This will follow the header and come beneath the reply pane in terms of the stacking order. We want the left alignment to match our header component here. and come down 1, 2, 3, 4 pixels. Let's make sure that hits on the bottom edge of our design, which it does, and that takes care of that. Switching over to the light variation, last step here. Similar process, delete that temporary inbox mockup, drag in our new organism component. Make sure it's in the correct stacking order. And let's get it aligned with the header in place here and drop it down 4 pixels. Now, if we take a look, everything looks great as we'd expect. And this is a great place to stop for this episode. So in the next episode, we'll tackle the message detail pane we see here, and then turn our attention eventually to the reply pane, which will finalize the entire design process of this project. So thank you so much for watching, and be sure to look out for the next episode.